Today, we are diving deep into history, economics, and even maritime warfare, all wrapped up in one pretty remarkable institution, the Sound Toll.
It's a fascinating one.
Our main source for this deep dive is a really comprehensive scholarly work edited by Ola Den. It details the whole history and the economics of this system at Elsinore, or Helsinger as it's known locally, right, between 1429 and 1857.
Yeah, it's a foundational text.
Yeah.
It really chronicles one of the longest-lasting, most profitable, and definitely most controversial taxes in European history.
And just to set the scene for everyone listening, for over 400 years, the Danish crown basically levied this tax, this mandatory fee, on almost every single foreign ship that passed through the Øresund Strait. You have to picture this geographical choke point. It's this really narrow waterway connecting the Baltic Sea, think timber, grain, all those vital goods, to the big markets of the North Sea in Western Europe.
A critical artery of trade.
Totally. And the passage was controlled entirely by military might. You had Kronborg Castle on the Danish side, looking right across at the Kernen Fortress, which, well, for some of the time was also Danish-controlled.
Right.
It was completely non-negotiable. You had to stop at Elsinore, you had to pay up, or, well, you faced the cannons.
Exactly. And our mission today, really, is to explore this whole system, the Sound Toll, not just as, a piece of interesting history, diplomatic history, royal history.
Which it definitely is.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But also as this kind of unparalleled economic case study. This institution, it lasted so long, and it operated as the perfect choke point tax. It allowed a, frankly, minor power, strategically placed,
Right.
to extract huge amounts of money, rent, essentially, from the global trading system for, 428 years?
Just incredible.
And what's really exciting here, especially for economists, quantitative historians, is that the records Denmark kept were incredibly detailed.
Yeah.
So we have this amazing opportunity to test fundamental economic theories. Things like the elasticity of demand for a critical trade route. Can you actually tax a monopoly passage like this forever without any consequences? The Sound Toll history, well, it gives us a pretty clear answer.
428 years. I mean, just the duration alone makes it extraordinary. We're not talking about some short-lived customs duty that got repealed after a decade or two.
No, this was bedrock.
This was one of Europe's oldest, most persistent trade regulations. So let's unpack this. How did what started as a simple medieval toll become this kind of modern fiscal juggernaut that shaped not just Denmark's wealth, but the whole commercial map of Northern Europe?
Well, the origins, like a lot of taxes, were actually quite simple. It was King Eric of Pomerania back in 1429 who introduced it.
Okay.
And initially, the justification, on paper at least, was, payment for maintaining lighthouses, providing security against pirates in those dangerous waters. Plausible deniability, perhaps?
A service fee, ostensibly. Maybe a convenient cover story, as you say. But it's the sheer scale of the revenue it generated that quickly turned it from just a fee into, well, the absolute cornerstone of the Danish state's finances.
That's the key.
And when you look at the numbers, they're staggering. By the late 16th century, so only about 150 years after it started.
Relatively quickly in historical terms.
Right. The revenue from the Sound Toll made up approximately 2/3 of Denmark's entire state income.
Pause on that. 2/3.
Yeah. We're not talking about a major industrial power here. This was a relatively small kingdom funding its entire government, its military, its courts, everything, through the single tax on other people's ships just passing through.
And that financial scale, that had huge internal political consequences. This is where it gets really interesting if you're studying state building.
How so?
Well, this guaranteed external revenue stream meant the Danish kings, especially after 1660 when they became absolute monarchs, they were remarkably independent of their own nobility, of the Privy Council.
Ah, okay.
They didn't have to go through that constant, tricky, often risky negotiation with their own aristocracy to fund things. The kind of internal land taxes that other monarchs struggled with.
So the King of Denmark could basically turn to his nobles and say, look, thanks for your input, but frankly, I don't actually need your money.
Precisely. It fundamentally shifted the balance of power inside Denmark. Think about it. Across Europe, monarchs in places like England or France, they fought for centuries to centralize financial power against these entrenched local interests.
Right, the Magna Carta, Parliament, all that.
Exactly. The Danish crown, though, they just used geography. They leveraged this choke point to achieve fiscal sovereignty. They were essentially using Dutch trade, English trade, Swedish trade to fund their own consolidation of power at home. It's almost a textbook case of how controlling an international choke point can turbocharge state formation.
And it wasn't just some, flash in the pan that faded out. Even right at the very end, in 1857, its final year.
When the pressure was immense.
Yeah, facing obsolescence, huge international pressure, the whole free trade ideology rising.
Yeah.
Even then, the toll still accounted for 1/8 of the entire Danish state budget.
Still significant.
That's what I call enduring fiscal value, right up until the moment they were forced to abolish it.
And that persistence, that long life, it was guaranteed by one crucial thing: enforcement. The policing mechanism was, let's just say, very effective, ruthless even.
You mentioned the setting earlier. Can you maybe paint a clear picture for us? What was it actually like for a merchant approaching Elsinore?
Okay, yeah. So you're sailing through this incredibly narrow strait, the Øresund, and suddenly looming over you is Kronborg Castle.
The Hamlet Castle, right?
The very one. Many people know it from Shakespeare. It's this imposing, very military structure, clearly designed to dominate the passage below. And the rule was simple. Every foreign vessel, no exceptions, had to drop anchor at Elsinore, Helsingør for inspection and, crucially, payment. If you were a Dutch merchant carrying vital grain from, say, Riga, or an English merchant with naval supplies from Sweden,
Stuff crucial for their economies.
absolutely essential, you had zero practical alternative but to stop and deal with the Danish customs officials, all under the shadow of those castle cannons.
And this military threat, it wasn't just for show. They actually used the cannons.
Oh, it wasn't a bluff. If ships refused to stop or maybe try to run the blockade, sneak through at night, the cannons of Kronborg and the fortress Kärnan on the other side, which was sometimes Danish, later Swedish they could, and records show they often did, open fire.
Wow.
The strait is so narrow. Trying to run that gauntlet wasn't just risky business. It was basically a suicidal business strategy. You wouldn't last long doing that.
So it was the perfect natural choke point, backed up by centuries of military investment.
Exactly. But, while that military force was key for the king's revenue, for us today, for scholars, the real treasure is actually the bureaucratic paperwork that came out of all this enforcement. The sound toll registers, the STR.
Right. This is where the story shifts a bit, from high politics and cannons to this incredible feat of data collection and preservation. This isn't just old dusty ledgers. It's described as an unparalleled data source.
It really is. The sheer scale is just mind-boggling. These registers, they run from 1497 all the way to 1857.
Continuously.
Well, nearly complete and continuous from 1574 onwards. And they comprise over 500 massive volumes. Huge handwritten ledger books.
500 volumes.
And they document something like 1.8 million individual ship passages through the Sound.
1.8 million. That's almost 2 million transactions detailing goods moving across Northern Europe for centuries.
And they're so important for understanding early modern European trade that UNESCO actually included them in its memory of the World Register.
That says a lot.
It really does. They represent probably the single most complete picture we have of European maritime trade flows for that entire 360-year period.
So what kind of details are actually in these logs? Because, the devil's in the details, especially if you want to do serious historical economics.
The level of detail is consistently minute, which is fantastic. For basically every passage, the registers record the ship's name, the master's name, the ship's home port or origin, its intended destination, and critically, the specific cargo being carried and the exact toll that was paid.
Specific cargo? You mean like?
Everything. We can track low-value bulk stuff like grain, hemp, canvas, timber, the staples, but also high-value specialized things, paintings, furs, famous Russian leather, exotic spices, even things like specialized weaponry.
Wow.
This granularity, this level of detail, it lets scholars reconstruct the really intricate web of European trade networks, the flows of goods, at a resolution that's just almost unmatched for this period.
So that means we can move beyond just, say, anecdotal stories about the Dutch Golden Age and actually quantify it, see exactly where their wealth was coming from.
Precisely. If you want to know the exact volume of rye flowing from, say, Koningsberg to Amsterdam in the 1640s, or you want to track the year-on-year volatility in Norwegian timber prices based on these Danish duty records, the STR holds the numbers, the quantitative proof.
That's incredible.
They absolutely do. And what's really transformed things in the last, say, decade or so is the accessibility. The Sound Toll Register's online SDR database, which was a huge project, completed around 2020 by the University of Groningen and Tresor.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, they digitized this massive data set, made it freely accessible online for researchers anywhere in the world.
So that effectively turned this, like you said, dusty historical archive into a modern quantitative research lab.
That's exactly what it is.
Hmm.
It means economists now can run complex time series models, analyze historical trade responses in ways that just weren't feasible even 20 years ago. Think about it. Most modern economic data sets, they rarely span more than 50, maybe 60 years if you're lucky.
Sure.
Here, we have a natural experiment, a laboratory, running for 360 years, documenting every price change, every commodity shift, every war, every famine, and allowing us to see how real economic agents responded to taxation over multiple human lifetimes.
It's an absolutely incredible resource. It lets us apply rigorous economic thinking to this 4th-century experiment in taxation. But okay, Denmark wasn't just relying on brute force, on cannons to keep the money flowing. They actually showed remarkable sophistication in how they structured the tax itself. Let's dig into how they actually priced their monopoly on this choke point.
Yeah, you hit on a really key point there. The system didn't stay static. It evolves quite dramatically over time. And that evolution reflects, I think, an increasingly shrewd grasp of merchant psychology, supply and demand, basic economics, really.
The first structure, back in 1429, that was pretty simple, wasn't it? Just a fee per ship.
Yes, very straightforward. A fixed fee per vessel. Easy to administer, count the ships, collect the money, but inherently inefficient if your goal is maximizing revenue.
Why that?
Well, it didn't matter if your ship was nearly empty or if it was absolutely packed to the gills with, I don't know, priceless paintings heading for a royal palace. The fee was essentially the same.
Ah, I see. So it incentivized packing the most valuable stuff you could into the biggest ships possible to dilute the cost.
Exactly. You're paying the same toll regardless of the cargo's value. They were leaving a lot of money on the table, basically.
And it took them quite a while to figure that out. The source says 138 years from 1429 to 1567 before they changed it.
Yeah, that's a surprisingly long delay, isn't it? It suggests maybe an initial lack of fiscal sophistication or perhaps just inertia. It wasn't until the reign of Frederick II that they really recognized this flaw. And in 1567, the toll went through this fundamental change, this transformation, to an ad valorem tax.
Okay, ad valorem meaning based on the value.
Exactly. Instead of a fixed fee per ship, vessels were now charged typically around 1 to 2% of their cargo's declared value.
And the impact of that change.
Immediate and dramatic. This structural shift, making the cost proportional to the value being shipped, it apparently tripled the state's revenue almost overnight.
Tripled? Wow.
Which suggests two things, right? First, that old fixed fee must have been way too cheap relative to the value passing through.
Clearly.
And second, even with this huge change of the cost structure, the short-run demand for using that Baltic route was still remarkably inelastic. Merchants grumbled, they hated the higher cost, but they still had to pay up because, well, there just wasn't a quick, viable alternative route.
And they kept refining this pricing mechanism over time. By the 19th century, it got even more detailed.
Right. They moved beyond just a general 1–2% based on declared value and got into specialized commodity tariffs. They became masters of essentially price discrimination based on the good itself.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The source mentions American ships in the 1840s, for instance, paying 20 cents per 100 pounds of cotton. Now, if you take that 20-cent charge and compare it to European cotton prices at the time,
It works out to
roughly that same 1–2% of the market value.
Yeah.
So they were still aiming for that sweet spot, that 1–2% range, but they were fine-tuning it commodity by commodity, presumably to maximize how much they could extract without killing the trade.
Okay, but shifting to an ad valorem tax, one based on declared value, that introduces the classic problem, right? Moral hazard. How do you stop merchants from just lying about the value of their cargo to pay less tax?
Yes. And this is where the Danish administration showed, frankly, real economic genius in their institutional design. They came up with an enforcement mechanism that economists actually still study today, the crown purchase.
The crown purchase, right, that sounds medieval. But it was a serious legal tool affecting global trade.
Oh, absolutely serious. And it was a brilliant piece of what we'd now call mechanism design. The Danish crown legally reserved the right to buy the merchant's entire cargo, not just fine them, buy the whole shipment at the exact value the merchant themselves had just declared for customs.
Okay, let's play this out. So I'm a, let's say, nervous Dutch merchant. I've got a load of fine Swedish iron, and I know deep down it's worth, say, 10,000 rigsdaler on the open market.
Right.
If I try to be clever and declare it's only worth 2,000 rigsdaler, my 2% toll bill drops from 200 down to just 40 rigsdaler. I save 160 rigsdaler. Seems like a good deal. But what's the catch?
The catch is catastrophic risk.
Yeah.
The Danish customs official, acting for the crown, could just step in and say, 2,000 rigsdaler. That sounds like a bargain. Thank you very much. We will exercise our right and purchase that entire load of iron from you right now for the 2,000 rigsdaler you just declared. The crown could then immediately turn around and sell that same iron on the open market for its true value, the 10,000 rigsdaler, netting themselves a cool 8,000 rigsdaler profit, while you, the merchant, have just had your entire cargo effectively expropriated for a fraction of its worth.
That would absolutely ruin a merchant, wouldn't it? One bad gamble like that.
Completely. And the beauty of this system, the genius of it, is that the crown probably didn't even need to invoke the right very often.
Just the threat was enough.
Exactly. Its power lay in its mere existence. It serves as a highly credible deterrent. If the customs officials had a reputation for occasionally, even rarely, exercising this right, it dramatically reduced the incentive, the elasticity of evasion, through deliberately undervaluing your goods.
So the merchant's own self-interest, their fear of losing everything, basically forced them to declare a price reasonably close to the true market value.
Pretty much. You might shave off a little, but you wouldn't dare lowball it drastically.
And that fact, that mechanism, explains why the reported price data in the sound toll registers is considered so exceptionally robust, so reliable for economic analysis today, even going back centuries.
It ensured a relatively high degree of accuracy in the tax base, which is frankly remarkable for a pre-modern bureaucracy. But, okay, beyond this ingenious enforcement trick, the Danes also used the toll system for more subtle geopolitical maneuvering through price discrimination.
Meaning the toll rates weren't the same for everyone?
Far from it. The whole system was layered with exemptions, special rates, often based on treaties that were usually the result of military conflicts.
Ah, winners get discounts.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
For instance, Sweden, Denmark's big rival, after they won some significant military victories in the mid-17th century, they were actually exempt from paying any tolls at all between 1660 and 1720.
Wow, a zero toll rate. That must have created a massive competitive advantage for Swedish shipping compared to, say, the Dutch or the English during that period.
Huge advantage. It fundamentally altered the demand elasticity between nations. If you were Swedish, your cost of using the sound was effectively zero, while your competitors faced the full 1–2% hit. That really changes the economics.
Right.
And you can actually track this geopolitical shift by looking at who bore the main financial burden of the toll over the centuries. Initially, back in the 16th and 17th centuries, the tax fell most heavily on Dutch and, ironically before their exemption, Swedish shipping, because they were the dominant players in the Baltic trade then.
But by the 19th century, as the world industrialized, that dependency, that burden shifted.
Yes. By the time the toll was nearing its end in the mid-1800s, British and Prussian vessels, just by sheer volume and the critical need for Baltic goods for their booming industrial economies.
Timber for ships, grain for workers, iron ore.
Exactly. They were bearing the heaviest load financially, which implies that their dependence on those Baltic goods had become increasingly inelastic over time.
Yeah.
They needed that route. They needed those goods more than others, meaning they were the most captive market, the ones most likely to just absorb the 1–2% cost without drastically changing their behavior. They were kind of the cash cow Denmark was milking right up until the very end.
Which brings us neatly to the core economic lesson here, right? This whole idea of elasticity, specifically the difference between short-run and long-run elasticity.
Precisely. That shift in who is paying highlights it perfectly.
So in the short run, it seems pretty clear. The Danish crown had this near-perfect monopoly. Demand for passage through the sound was highly inelastic. You just had to pay.
Because practically speaking, there were very few truly viable alternatives, especially for large-scale trade. While ships could technically reach the Baltic by navigating the Little Belt or the Great Belt.
Other straits nearby?
Right. But the source material consistently shows that over centuries, shipping through the Great Belt, the main alternative, only accounted for about 15% of the total traffic.
Only 15%. If you could save potentially 1 or 2% of your entire cargo's value by taking a different route, why wouldn't everybody try to do that? Why so low?
Well, because those alternative routes were, frankly, treacherous geographically and often inefficient economically. The Little Belt is quite shallow. It has strong, unpredictable currents, and navigating it safely required very specialized local knowledge. Not great for large international vessels.
Okay.
The Great Belt is wider, sure, but historically it was plagued by difficult winds, lots of hidden reefs, and crucially, it meant a significantly longer sailing time, especially for the bigger merchant ships used in long-distance trade back then.
And time is money for merchants, always.
Always. A detour that might save you 1% on the toll, but significantly increases your risk of shipwreck or delays your delivery by 2 weeks. That's often not a rational economic choice. So yes, in the short term, if you needed quick, reliable, safe access to Baltic grain or timber or naval stores, you gritted your teeth and paid the 1 to 2% tax at Elsinore.
But the history of the Sound Toll isn't just a success story for Denmark, it's ultimately a story of failure in the long run, isn't it? Because merchants and the powerful states backing them, they weren't just going to passively accept this 1-2% tax forever. They started looking for ways around it, real ways around it.
Absolutely. They started actively seeking out and, crucially, investing in substitutes. And the clearest, most dramatic evidence of this high, long-run elasticity of substitution is the political will and the immense capital invested in building rival infrastructure. You don't need to look much further than the Swedish Gotha Canal.
Right, this wasn't just digging a small ditch. This was a monumental, multi-decade national project for Sweden.
It was an absolutely extraordinary undertaking. Sweden began construction on the Gotha Canal in the early 1810s, and its primary strategic purpose was completely explicit. Create an internal waterway linking the North Sea near Gothenburg via lakes and rivers all the way to the Baltic Sea, completely bypassing Danish territory and the Sound Toll.
Avoiding Denmark altogether.
Entirely. Now think about the staggering economics of that decision. This canal meant cutting through hundreds of kilometers of terrain, engineering dozens of complex locks, moving massive amounts of earth, employing thousands of soldiers and workers for decades. The initial construction cost was astronomical for Sweden at the time, an investment that could have funded several years of their entire military budget.
So the merchants, or rather the Swedish state acting partly on their behalf, they were willing to sink that colossal amount of capital into this project. Why? Because the net present value, the estimated future cost of paying that seemingly small 1-2% Danish toll stretched out potentially forever, was actually high enough to justify moving mountains, literally.
Absolutely. That's the perfect way to put it. The long-term cost of avoiding the tax justified this incredibly expensive capital-intensive solution. The Gotha Canal stands today as this massive physical monument to high long-term elasticity of demand. The Sound Toll, simply by existing for so long and being so effective, was effectively pricing itself out of existence by creating the ultimate incentive for its rivals to build billion-dollar bypasses.
And the pressure wasn't only coming from canals, right? The rise of other transport technologies in the 19th century also played a role.
Yes, absolutely. The parallel development of railroads across continental Europe, particularly in Germany and Prussia, also started chipping away at the reliance on the Sound for certain types of goods.
How so?
Well, railroads offered a new land-based alternative to connect Eastern European supply centers with Western European ports and markets, especially for higher value or more time-sensitive goods. It further shrank the pool of truly captive demand for that specific maritime route through the Sound. More options emerged.
And we can actually see quantitative evidence of this elastic response, this growing merchant avoidance in Denmark's own revenue figures in the decades leading up to the toll's abolition.
We can. The period between roughly 1830 and 1850 is very telling. Now, this was a time of massive expansion in overall European maritime trade. Things were booming. The sources mentioned over 15,000 ships crossing the Sound in 1840 alone.
15,000 ships?
Yeah, huge numbers, including like 4,000 British ships, 3,000 Prussian ships. But despite this explosion in traffic volume, the revenue Denmark collected from the Sound Toll grew at only about 1% per year during that period.
Wait a minute. If the volume of trade passing through is booming like that, but the tax revenue is barely increasing, that must mean the effective toll rate per ship or per unit of value was actually falling? Or avoidance was just rampant.
Precisely. That severe revenue stagnation is a huge red flag. It strongly indicates that all these cumulative merchant adaptations, whether it was slightly rerouting, maybe more sophisticated smuggling, perhaps shifting the mix of cargo towards goods with lower specific tariffs, or actually utilizing the new infrastructure like the Gotha Canal, all these strategies were successfully limiting Denmark's ability to capture the full benefit of the trade boom. They were hitting the ceiling of what the market would bear, even at that seemingly low 1-2% rate.
And there's specific evidence from American shipping, too, showing this kind of highly elastic behavior.
Yes, American shipping provides a really neat case study of high elasticity, partly because the U.S. was a newer player without long-standing treaty obligations. Back in the late 1700s, U.S. vessels were reportedly paying around $100,000 a year in total sound tolls.
Which was significant money back then for the young U.S. merchant fleet.
Definitely. Now, fast forward to the final decade of the toll. The source looked at the 5 years ending in 1848. In that entire 5-year period, only 264 American ships passed through, paying a total of about 570,000 Danish rigsdaler.
Okay, so if you average that out annually and consider currency fluctuations, it sounds like a much lower aggregate payment, especially given that America was becoming a much bigger global trader by the 1840s.
Exactly. It suggests American merchants weren't just trying to pay less per ship. They were actively finding ways to reduce their overall reliance on the Sound Passage itself. Maybe they were choosing to import Baltic goods via British or German middlemen who paid the toll. Or perhaps they were shifting their trade patterns entirely, sourcing timber or grain from places not subject to this particular Danish tax. They showed a highly elastic, very adaptive demand response, basically voting with their feet, or rather their hulls, whenever feasible.
Which leads us to the political endgame. This toll wasn't just an economic issue, it was always a political powder keg.
Always. It generated constant diplomatic friction throughout its entire 4th-century existence. It wasn't just background noise. It was a major irritant in international relations.
And sometimes more than an irritant. The outline mentions it even rose to the level of an official casus belli, a formal reason for declaring war.
Yes, explicitly. During the Torstenson War in 1643 between Sweden and Denmark, the Swedish declaration of war specifically cited Danish control over the Sound and the toll as a primary grievance, a key justification for hostilities.
So lives were lost over this 1-2% tax.
Undoubtedly. And by the 19th century, these tensions just escalated dramatically. This was fueled partly by the rise of new global powers, particularly the United States, and also by the spreading ideology of free trade that really gained steam after the Napoleonic Wars. The sources specifically highlight the intense American-Danish sound toll controversy.
Tell me more about that.
Well, this became a real diplomatic sticking point. You had the young, assertive United States, which had no historical treaties or special arrangements with Denmark regarding the Sound. And they increasingly objected on principle to paying any tax levied by what they saw as a minor European power simply for passage through waters the U.S. considered international.
Freedom of the seas.
Exactly. It tied the Sound toll directly into broader U.S. foreign policy debates about maritime rights and challenging old European systems. It showed how the issue had really ballooned far beyond just local Baltic traders' concerns.
And eventually international pressure just became too much for Denmark. It culminated in 1857.
It did. Denmark found itself increasingly isolated. Facing the real possibility of military confrontation, perhaps with a coalition of angry maritime powers, they were ultimately forced to the negotiating table. The result was the Copenhagen Convention of 1857, which formally abolished the Sound toll.
The end of an era, 428 years later.
For a very long era. And this abolition, the way it happened, actually provides one of the most fascinating economic data points in the whole story. It gives us a kind of hard valuation of the toll itself. Because abolishing a revenue stream that had lasted 4 centuries, and it was still significant, well, it required Denmark to be bought out. They demanded substantial financial compensation from the international community.
Right. What was the final price tag for getting rid of the Sound toll forever? For perpetual free passage?
So the total compensation package agreed upon was 35 million Danish rigsdaler.
35 million. Now that sounds like a lot, but we need some context. What did 35 million rigsdaler actually mean back in 1857?
It was an absolutely immense sum for Denmark at the time. The sources indicate it was roughly equivalent to 1 full year's total state expenditure for the entire Danish kingdom.
Wow. Imagine the U.S. government today getting a single check equal to its entire annual federal budget.
Exactly. It was a massive fiscal windfall, immediate relief, which shows just how valuable that toll revenue still was, even in its final years. It wasn't peanuts they were giving up.
And who paid this bill? Who ponied up the cash?
Predictably, the cost was mainly borne by the major maritime powers whose shipping stood to benefit most from free passage. The United Kingdom and Russia, both heavily reliant on Baltic resources for their economies and navies, they each paid nearly 30% of the total $35 million. Prussia chipped in about 13%.
Okay, what about the United States? They were such vocal opponents. The outline mentioned a possibly different figure for them.
That's a great point, and it shows the complexity here.
Mm.
The U.S., remember, likely had more elastic demand. They were more willing to find alternatives, and their overall traffic volume through the Sound was lower than Britain's or Russia's at that point. So they negotiated a separate deal outside the main Copenhagen Convention framework.
And they paid?
They paid $393,000, a much smaller sum. This reflected the fact that they were essentially compensating Denmark only for the estimated capitalized value of future tolls expected specifically from American ships, which were relatively few, rather than contributing to the big multilateral pot that covered the value of all international trade passing through.
Interesting nuance. But that main compensation package, the 35 million Rigsdaler paid by the European powers, that's effectively a final market-based valuation signal, isn't it? It tells us what the rest of the world collectively thought that future stream of toll revenue was actually worth in 1857.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating moment where the market, or at least international diplomacy acting like a market, put a price tag on this ancient tax.
Yeah.
And we can use those numbers to do a really neat piece of historical economic detective work.
How so?
Well, we know that in the mid-1850s, just before abolition, the toll was bringing in about 2.5 million Rigsdalers per year for Denmark.
Okay.
And the total buyout price was 35 million Rigsdaler. If you divide the annual income, 2.5 million, by the total price, 35 million, or think about it as the implied rate of return needed to justify paying 35 million for a 2.5 million annual stream.
You get an implied discount rate.
Exactly. The math implies that the negotiating powers, Britain, Russia, Prussia, were valuing that perpetual revenue stream using an implicit discount rate of approximately 7%. 35, 2.5 is 14, the inverse of which is roughly 7%.
Okay, why is that specific number, 7%, so significant for a historian or an economist looking back?
Because it reveals a lot about the collective risk assessment these major powers were making about the future of the toll had it continued. In 1857, a very safe investment, like a government bond, might have yielded maybe 3%, perhaps 4%. A 7% discount rate is significantly higher than the risk-free rate.
Meaning they saw the future toll revenue as relatively risky?
Precisely. A high discount rate, like 7%, suggests that while these powers believed the toll could continue generating revenue for the foreseeable future, they were factoring in significant risk. They weren't willing to pay a price reflecting a guaranteed, perpetual 2.5 million income stream growing forever.
What kinds of risks were they likely accounting for in that 7% rate?
They were almost certainly factoring in future elasticity. They were implicitly betting that even if the toll hadn't been abolished by treaty, merchant behavior would continue to adapt. More canals might be built, railroads would become more competitive, maybe smuggling techniques would improve, political pressure would keep mounting. All factors that would increasingly limit Denmark's ability to raise, or maybe even maintain, that 2.5 million Rigsdaler revenue stream indefinitely.
So they weren't confident it would last forever at that level.
Exactly. A lower discount rate, say closer to 3 or 4%, would have implied they expected the revenue to be rock solid, maybe even grow, with zero risk of substitution or political challenge. That 7% rate explicitly acknowledges the inherent long-term vulnerability of chokepoint monopolies, especially in a world seeing rapid technological change, rising free trade ideology, and increasing investment in infrastructure.
Ultimately then, summing up its economic function, the toll acted like a massive non-tariff trade barrier. It extracted rent for Denmark, sure, but it imposed a much larger cost on the overall European economy.
It absolutely did. For centuries, it artificially widened the price gap, the price spread, between Baltic commodities, timber, iron, grain at their source, and their final prices in the major Western European ports like Amsterdam, London, or Hamburg. This barrier prevented full, efficient market integration between these key trading zones.
And the true economic drain, the concept economists call deadweight loss, or DWL, the value lost to inefficiency because of the tax. How did that manifest itself here? We talk about DWL with modern taxes, but what did it look like back then?
The deadweight loss from the Sound toll was likely immense, far larger than the revenue collected. It wasn't just the inefficiency of slightly higher prices, it was the value destroyed by the costly avoidance strategies it incentivized. Think about the inefficient routing, the delayed trade, the ships perhaps taking longer, riskier routes.
And the most vivid example of that DWL.
It has to be the Gouda Canal. All that capital, all that labor, all those resources poured into digging that massive canal across Sweden.
Resources that could have built factories or schools or improved agriculture.
Exactly. Instead, they were consumed primarily just to circumvent a 1-2% tax levied by a neighboring kingdom. That huge cost of avoidance, that massive inefficient allocation of Sweden's national resources, is a classic example of deadweight loss. It far, far exceeded the actual fiscal benefit the Danish crown gained from the toll itself in those later years. The toll was profitable for the Danish state, no doubt, but it was almost certainly deeply detrimental to the overall efficiency and prosperity of the wider European economy.
So if we sort of step back and look at the big picture over these 4 centuries, the core economic story, the duality of the sound toll, seems really clear. For a very long time, Denmark successfully exploited the short-run inelasticity of demand at this critical geographical choke point.
They did. They secured massive, reliable, centralized revenue that, as we discussed, was fundamental to funding their state-building project, making their monarchy strong and independent.
That very success, the sustained imposition of that cost, even if it was only 1–2%, it absolutely guaranteed a high long-run elasticity of substitution.
It had to. That persistent fee acted like this powerful financial magnet, constantly pulling investment and ingenuity towards finding ways around it.
Which eventually resulted in rival infrastructure like the Gotha Canal, increasing pressure from railroads, and finally this coordinated international political and financial buyout. The long run finally caught up.
It always does eventually, with monopolies facing potential substitutes. And what's truly remarkable is that thanks to the sheer depth, the meticulous detail of those sound toll registers.
That UNESCO-recognized treasure trove you mentioned, 500 volumes now digitized.
Exactly. Thanks to that incredible resource, quantitative historians today have this unique, multi-century economic laboratory. They can analyze with real precision how trade volumes, commodity prices, even merchant cheating or avoidance strategies responded to every specific tariff change, every geopolitical shock like a war, every economic boom or bust across 360 years of European history.
It really is an amazing resource for anyone interested in the nuts and bolts of global trade history and how taxation actually works in practice over the very long term.
It truly is a gift to researchers.
And it leaves us with maybe one final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The abolition of the sound toll in 1857 wasn't gradual, it was sudden. It represented this massive exogenous shock, a sudden removal of transaction costs right across the entire Northern European marketplace. This 4-century-old trade friction just vanished overnight.
A huge change.
So the question is, how quickly did that removal of a persistent centuries-old trade barrier actually allow prices to converge? How fast did full market integration between the Baltic economies and Western Europe finally accelerate in the years immediately following that Copenhagen Convention? Was the impact instant, or did the legacy effects of the toll, the established trade patterns, take decades more to fully unwind?
That's a great question, a deep dive question perhaps for another time.